This is a lesson based on a tradition called the Four Noble Truths. Briefly, those truths are the first truth of suffering, the second truth of the cause of suffering, and the third truth of the discontinuing of the cause of suffering, and the fourth truth of the way to live life after suffering, beyond suffering. So that's what this is about. If you're interested in the subject of suffering and life beyond suffering, then you may enjoy this. I want to note that there are other variations on these Four Noble Truths. This is just one variation. I'll say more about that towards the end. The first truth of suffering involves relating to life as if there is some part of life that should not be how it is. That's suffering. That's what I mean by suffering. Relating to some part of life like it should not be how it is. And that's it. Suffering is not simply pain or illness or old age or dying or even violence. None of that's suffering. Suffering is related to some part of life as if it should not be how it actually is. That's it. Suffering is a way of relating to life in language. Suffering involves ill will. We could say suffering is the root of, or suffering includes all the various forms of suffering, such as ill will, contempt, enduring madness, as in mental illness, as in agonizing, as in hell. While there are a variety of forms and intensities of suffering, what I mean by the word suffering includes all of them. So the second truth of the cause of suffering involves the recognizing of the power of words. Words are symbolic codes with an origin as signals in sound or signals of sound, though words can also be written. The term words can even include gestures and hand signals or sign languages. That was, I think, that was the letters for words, W-O-R-D-S, the letters to spell the word words in sign language, American Sign Language. So words are distinct from a mere signal because of the importance of the sequencing of words. Just like with letters, W-O-R-D is not the same as D-O-W-R, right? The sequence matters. So the signals aren't just independent signals. There's a sequence of symbols, and the actual sequence is the language. It's not just an individual signal. Now we're talking about words and language put together in a relatively complex way. So words are distinct from a mere signal because of the importance of the sequencing of the words. Words are the origin of what can be called nonsense. And this is really important because the whole framework of suffering is nonsense in language. Words are the origin of what can be called nonsense, such as this should be what should not be. See how that's nonsense? This should be what it should not be. That doesn't make any sense. You can have those kind of nonsense constructions of words in words. You can't have that stuff without words. Inside of words, nonsense is possible. And that's really important because the whole realm of suffering is based on nonsense. When you get the nonsense upon which the whole realm of nonsense of suffering nonsense is based, there is no more belief in life should not be like this. So the second truth, briefly, is that all suffering is caused by nonsense made of words. Specifically, this should not be how it is the kind of formation in words that can correspond to the experience of suffering. At least if there is a belief in the nonsense rather than a recognition of the nonsense as nonsense. This should not be how it is further rooted in there is exactly one way that this should be. And any other way, therefore, must be what should not be, because there's exactly one way that this should be. In other words, suffering is rooted in the linguistic model of there is exactly one way that this should be, at least as applies to some particular perception or experience. There is exactly one way that this should be is further rooted in there is exactly one way that life should be, which is nonsense. It's based on a misunderstanding of language. And we'll come back to that. So, if operating as if it is inherently true that life should be a certain way, then suffering is the natural and inevitable result. And that's actually good news. That suffering could be in the form of ill will, as in contempt or enduring madness, or mental illness, or agonizing, or in hell. That's all possible. Those are all forms of suffering. So the suffering based on this should not be how it is could result in ill will, contempt, mental illness, enduring madness, or resentment. Another word for enduring madness. Agonizing, hell. All those terminologies refer to suffering that's rooted in this should not be how it is, and a belief in the language this should not be how it is, and things like that. So less intense forms of suffering would be things like mere frustration, worry, resentment, sorrow, grief. Those are still within the realm of suffering because those are all based on a concern for what should not be. So earlier than the belief in language that there is exactly one way that life should be is another presumption in language, and that presumption is there's exactly one way that life is, which is also nonsense. So if there's a belief in the nonsense that there's exactly one way that life is, then that leads to the belief in the nonsense that there's exactly one way that life should be, which is also the way that it allegedly is, the only way that it is, right? And that leads to the various forms of suffering, such as shame and blame and rage, because stuff shouldn't be like it is. So if there's a belief that there's exactly one way that a particular thing is, which is also the way that it should be, then that belief in nonsense inevitably leads to various forms of suffering, whether something mild like grief or frustration, or something intense like contempt and rage. So beliefs are made of words. Beliefs are all nonsense. That doesn't mean they're not useful. I'm not actually going to get into how they are useful really in this whole presentation. Some of my other content refers to the intentional use of beliefs for influencing the perception and behavior of other people, but I'm just going to make that quick note and move on. So beliefs are all nonsense. They are the origin of suffering, and beliefs in what should be produce suffering. Naturally, inevitably. Beliefs in what should be produce suffering. Beliefs are all nonsense in words, but believing in beliefs produces suffering. So belief in what is also produces suffering. Because once I think this is how it is, that overlaps right into, and that's the only way it should be, and there's exactly one way it should be, and that's the way it is, and then you have this whole tension around this language, this construction in language. It's just a construction in language. It's just nonsense. So belief is also called idealism and idolatry and foolishness. Those are other labels that all could apply. Whenever we're talking about belief, whenever we're talking about what should be and the way it really is, that's foolishness, idolatry, vanity is another word for that. Idealism in the Judeo-Christian New Testament, there's a lot of references to vanity and the difference between people using some language like repeating it, using lip service, and having it really be something that they're expressing with attention and with fluency, like where their language really is a fit for what's going on for them. So people are in the process of learning how to work with language and how to interact with language. And when people are in the stage of suffering, in the mode of experiencing life in terms of what should be and what should not be, that's actually a normal stage of development. You kind of, in processing through linguistic development, that's one of the stages. It's not that it shouldn't be one of the stages. It is one of the stages. All right. So I'm going to take a break here in a moment and talk about the third noble truth. But before we do, go into the discontinuing of the cause of suffering, let's review. The first noble truth is that suffering is relating to some part of life as if it should not be how it is. And the second noble truth is that suffering originates in the belief that there is exactly one way that a particular part of life is, and that's the only way that it should be. And anything else should not be. And on from there you get resentment, frustration, contempt, worry, and so forth. Shame, grief, all that stuff.